Welcome back. In this video, we're going to study together Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 to 9. Let's begin by reading the text. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. The first thing I want you to notice is that these first three verses of Daniel 4 are in the form of a letter. First, we have the sender, King Nebuchadnezzar, and the recipients. The letter is addressed to the nations and peoples of every language. Now, notice that this is the same group who were told to bow down to the image of gold in Daniel 3:7. And really, this is exaggerated language for Nebuchadnezzar's extended kingdom. It's actually typical of Assyrian and Babylonian empires to claim that they rule the whole earth. But this is really hyperbole. So really, it's referring to the people in Babylon, in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And then the greeting follows next, where he says, may you prosper greatly. And then he tells them what his reasons are for writing. He says that he's writing to share about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God had performed for him. Now, that term, Most High God, had been used in Daniel 3 to refer to Daniel's three friends. And here Nebuchadnezzar praises this same God for what he calls his signs and wonders. Those words, signs and wonders, are equivalent to the Hebrew expression that was used in relation to God's power that had been unleashed in contest with the Pharaoh of Egypt in Exodus 7:3. And these signs and wonders performed for Nebuchadnezzar could include, for instance, the revelation of his dream in Daniel 2. It could also include the fact that 3 Jews had been delivered from a fiery furnace. But I think specifically it could refer here, and most likely refers primarily, if not exclusively here, to the removal and restoration of Nebuchadnezzar's sanity and of his kingdom. So the point is that after all that God has done, Nebuchadnezzar finally proclaims that this God, the Most High God, his kingdom is an eternal kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. Now, this is the message of Daniel 4, that Daniel's God is sovereign. And it agrees with the message of the dream in Daniel 2. You'll remember in Daniel 2, verse 44, we're told that God would set up a kingdom which would endure forever. It seems in Daniel 3 that Nebuchadnezzar had been resisting that kingdom by trying to set up a statue that was of his kingdom, all of gold, that the point seemed to be that was going to last forever. But he now seems to have come to accept and to acknowledge, after the miracles that God has worked in his life, that the kingdom of this Most High God is the one that would endure forever and not his own. So the letter, that's Daniel 4, 1 to 3, really serves as an introductory to the story of the miraculous signs and wonders that lead Nebuchadnezzar to the conviction that he expresses in these 3 verses. So what we find that follows in verses 4 to 37 of Daniel 4 really is a flashback in which Nebuchadnezzar tells his readers how he came to view God and his kingdom in the same way that he describes in Daniel chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. So see Daniel 4, 1 to 3 as an introduction, let's say in the present time, and then when we get to verses 4 to 37, we are going back in time, kind of like a flashback technique, which tells us how we end up to the place where he is at in verses 1 to 3, which is the whole point of the story. So the other thing that I want to point out is that all of Daniel 4 is in the first person. Nebuchadnezzar speaks about I and me. except for verses 19 to 33. And those verses relate, firstly, Daniel's interpretation of the king's dream, and secondly, the story of the king's period of insanity. And those verses 19 to 33, are in the third person. They refer to the king as he and him, and so forth. So the story of the king's insanity, if you think about it, would appropriately be in the third person, as the king would not have been able to personally report on this episode due to his deranged mental condition. And perhaps the description of Daniel relating to the king, what his dream was about, is also in the third person, because this is not coming directly from the king. Anyhow, in verses 1 to 3 and verses 34 to 37, these are in the first person. So where the king tells why he's telling about this dream, and where he is telling about the dream and the story in between, we find a pagan king who had conquered Jerusalem praising God in the first person. This is very unique. And it conveys, I think, a message to the Jews in exile who've been ruled by Gentile kings, that despite appearances to the contrary, God was in control. In other words, here we have this great Babylonian king, and he is, by God's power and the miracles and wonders that God had performed, brought to the point that he is in his own first person narrative praising God. This is a declaration of how God was in control. Okay, so let's read what follows in verses 4 to 5. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid as I was lying in bed. The images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. Now first, that word contented, the Aramaic word that is translated contented in our English versions, really means to be at ease or at rest. And so it would have conveyed both security and contentment. And the Aramaic word that is translated prosperous there in the NIV would mean luxuriant or flourishing, like a tree or a plant. And that's preparing us for the tree of the image that is to come, as we're told the rest of the dream. So Nebuchadnezzar's flashback story begins with him enjoying good times. He's at home, he's in his palace, he's contented and he's prosperous, and he's basking in his success and his achievements, and he's enjoying political, military, and economic stability. So good times like these, if you're like me, tend to fill our hearts with pride and self-sufficiency. You know, if we have wealth and health and success and achievements, we feel like take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. You have many of great things laid up for the future. But this is really a false sense of security. And Nebuchadnezzar's peace of mind is soon to be shattered, because we're next told that the king has a dream which makes him afraid. And Nebuchadnezzar says that as he's lying in bed, images and visions pass through his mind and terrify him. And this would have reminded us, or reminds us, of Daniel 2, where he has dreams which belie his own insecurity. He's terrified by some future prospect. So the king is afraid and he's terrified despite his wealth and his power, his success, and the security of the great walls of Babylon. He is terrified. Now, this brings to mind Psalm 30, verses 6 to 7. If I could read that for you. The psalmist says, "When I felt secure, I said, I will never be shaken. Lord, when you favored me, you made my royal mountain stand firm. But when you hid your face, I was dismayed." You know, the psalmist is at the place where he recognizes that when things are going well and he feels secure, it can give him a false sense of confidence, like he's never going to be in a place where he will be shaken. But he comes to recognize that it really is because of God's favor and God making, as he puts it, his royal mountain stand firm, why he has that security. And the reality he recognizes is that if he is somehow separated from God, if God is to hide his face, then he becomes dismayed. In Nebuchadnezzar's words, he becomes terrified. He no longer feels as secure. The point is that our security comes from God and not our circumstances. And when we forget God or we leave him out of the equation, we really set ourselves up for our false security and peace of mind to be shattered and replaced by fear and terror. And this, I think, is what describes Nebuchadnezzar's situation. He had a false sense of security. He was at ease and flourishing. His kingdom was coming along just fine. And I think he was probably patting himself on the back for having done such a good job of ruling the Babylonian kingdom. He had literally fought hard to get where he was, often by brutality and the oppression of others. And Nebuchadnezzar perhaps fully expected to enjoy the fruit of his efforts. But just when everything seemed to be going right for him, the picture suddenly changed. You see, God decided that he would shake Nebuchadnezzar's world up. And God removed his hand, or in the language of the psalmist, he hid his face. And this showed Nebuchadnezzar that what was making his situation so great and secure was God, and not any of his accomplishments or power or the mighty walls of Babylon. Sometimes God gets our attention by showing us that our lives depend on him, and that our security is found in him, and not in our efforts or how good our situation is. And this teaches us that our real goal in life should be staying close to God and not being at ease and flourishing. Well, as we said, Nebuchadnezzar is afraid because of his dreams, and he's feeling insecure despite all his success and all the fortifications of the wall of Babylon. So what does he do? He says, "So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me." So, just like in Daniel 2, the king summons his wise men to interpret the dream for him, but they are unable to do so. And so what we have here again is a tale of court contests that's setting us up to see that Daniel's God is superior to the gods of Babylon. We read in verse 8, "Finally Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. He's called Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me." Now, firstly, Daniel comes in, and the king is at pains to point out that he is called Belteshazzar after the name of his god. That is Nebuchadnezzar's god. And that god is Bel. And that word Bel is the Akkadian for the word Lord, and perhaps referred to Marduk, who was the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon. And so Belteshazzar meant Bel protect the king, or something like Marduk protect the king. And so it would have emphasized Daniel's status in Babylon, and it would have suggested the dominance and supremacy of the Babylonian god, which Nebuchadnezzar trusted in to protect him. It is this false Babylonian narrative and worldview that the tale of court contest in Daniel 4 is meant to overthrow. In other words, the point is that it really was not Bel who would protect Nebuchadnezzar, who was supreme. It was Daniel's God, Yahweh, who was worthy of praise and reliance. And in fact, Daniel's name, Daniel, meant God is my judge. And Daniel would have been referring not to Bel, but to Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. Something else that we ought to consider is the meaning of spirit of the holy gods, which Nebuchadnezzar says is in Daniel. From Nebuchadnezzar's polytheistic, meaning he worshipped several gods, from that polytheistic perspective, Daniel's divine powers of revelation, which he would have experienced in Daniel 2, came from one of several gods who were holy, and holy there would have referred to the fact that they were set apart in the sense of being above humans. So that's what holy means. Holy means to be set apart. So not in the sense necessarily he's thinking of a moral sense but perhaps a sense of status, set apart in the sense of being above humans. Now, the translation gods in the NIV rendered spirit of the holy gods comes from the plural Aramaic word Elohim. Now, in Hebrew, the general word for God, that is the God of the Bible, is Elohim, which, like Elohim, is grammatically plural. In other words, it can be translated gods, plural, generally speaking, but it's also used to refer to the Hebrew God, the God of the Bible, as in God, singular, perhaps with a big G. So depending on the context, it either is referring to God, Elohim, or it's saying gods. But from Nebuchadnezzar's polytheistic perspective, the word should be properly translated with the plural gods, as the NIV has done, and not as a singular God, as some would want to read it, as in Nebuchadnezzar thinking that Daniel is filled with the spirit of the holy God, as if Nebuchadnezzar was referring to Daniel's God alone. I hope you're following me. But there is some ambiguity here nonetheless, which is possibly intentional on the part of the biblical writer, as from a Jewish point of view and from that of the narrator, since the Hebrew and Aramaic plural word for gods was also used to refer to the God of the Bible, it could also read the spirit of the holy God is in him. So, Aubrey Buster and John Walton write, it is very likely that the authors of Daniel 4 and 5, where a similar construction occurs, spirit of the God or gods, are introducing a clever ambiguity into the text. From Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, the God who is granting to Daniel such powers of divination could be any deity from the pantheon, or for that matter, one of the deities from another culture. From the perspective of the Judean author and audience, however, the idea that one of the Babylonian deities had possessed Daniel would have been unconscionable. The author uses terms that both fit with the religious perspective of Nebuchadnezzar, who's certainly no monotheist, worshiping one God, and also communicate the full truth to his Judean audience that Daniel is possessed of the spirit of one God, Yahweh. So, they're suggesting that the language could be intentionally ambiguous. On the one hand, fitting with what would clearly make sense, Nebuchadnezzar thinking that the spirit of the gods, or one of the gods, was in Daniel, but also with the Jewish sense that the spirit of the God of the Bible was in Daniel. The spirit of the holy God, the God of the Bible being in Daniel, also tracks, I believe, with Daniel 1:17, where we're told that God gave Daniel wisdom and the ability to interpret dreams, and also with Daniel 2, in which we see that it is God who reveals the king's dreams to Daniel and is called a revealer of mysteries. In any event, the king says that no mystery is too difficult for Daniel because the spirit of the holy God is in him. And that, I think, reminds us of Daniel 2:27 to 28, in which Daniel tells the king that no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery that he had asked about. But there was a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And verse 30 goes on to say, Daniel says, as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive. So Nebuchadnezzar's statement that no mystery is too difficult for Daniel also reminds us of Joseph in Genesis 41, which is another court tale of contest. And in verse 15, Pharaoh says to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph replied, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So Joseph, like Daniel, tells Pharaoh that it is God, not himself, who is able to interpret his dream. And then Pharaoh says something that is quite similar to what Nebuchadnezzar says about Daniel. So Pharaoh says something similar about Joseph in Genesis 41:38, which sounds quite like what Nebuchadnezzar says about Daniel. He says, "Can we find anyone like this man?" Notice the words, "one in whom is the Spirit of God." So Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar both recognize that God is at work in Joseph and in Daniel in a way that was superior to the abilities of their wise men to interpret their dreams. And the parallel of these two Jews serving in the courts of foreign kings over empires which were superpowers at the time is clear. In both cases, it is the God of these Jews who are able to reveal mysteries to these kings through their faithful servants and not the wise men who serve the false gods of these nations. The story is setting us up to see that it is Daniel's God, not Nebuchadnezzar's God, whether he's Bel protect him, after which Daniel was named, or any other god of the Babylonian pantheon, who had the power to interpret the dream and to control the circumstances which were terrifying the king. The king says, finally, "Here's my dream, interpret it." Notice he doesn't ask Daniel to tell him the dream like he does in Daniel 2, simply to interpret it for him, and perhaps by this time, having experienced Daniel's ability to interpret dreams like in Daniel 2, he's prepared to just go straight to hearing the interpretation. Well, in our next video, we'll study verses 10 to 18 of Daniel 4, in which the king tells Daniel the dream. I hope you'll join us then as we continue our study of Daniel chapter 4. I look forward to seeing you then.